Pig. Hooray!
Can we hug?
Hi, lovely to meet you. Oh, thank you so much, guys. Yeah, oh, I'm here. Okay. So, you should know that I've been triple jabbed, and I am in favour of the vaccine, but I'm also in favour of people having a choice. Yeah. And there are people in my family who are not vaccinated. I really want to use this as a chance to understand as much as I possibly can. So we've got 5 days together, and I want to listen to all of your viewpoints. I want to hear all of your stories. And for me, I think science is all about asking questions, about examining the evidence, and really about being willing to change your mind. Are you up for the challenge?
So it looks like Hannah Fry's strings are still intact, and she's been taken out of the box and dusted off to perform once more for the BBC. There's an awful lot of weirdness about this programme, and although I'm tempted to pile in with all the speculation about it, I'm doing my best to resist, because my hunch is that it was put out there to provoke precisely such a reaction. But there's one thing that keeps nagging at me, which is this. The BBC Media Centre's pre-broadcast publicity implies that the participants were taking part in an experiment. Quote, "At the end of the experiment, each contributor is asked if what they have learned has changed their mind and whether they will now take up the vaccine." And yet there was no mention of the word experiment during the show. Watching the documentary, it looks to me like some sort of psychological experiment really is taking place, but that Hannah is making something of a clumsy hash of it, and so most of the footage of this potential experiment probably ended up on the cutting room floor. If this really is the case, then who commissioned the experiment, who designed it, and did it gain ethical approval? It strikes me that Hannah Fry was not a good fit as presenter for this programme. She is branded by the BBC as a professional mathematician, not a medical specialist or psychologist, and although she diligently sticks to the script, she appears out of her depth right from the word go. Comparing this performance to her 2018 role in the BBC pandemic documentary as Patient Zero, I'd say that she has lost her sparkle and looks conspicuously alone with no co-presenter or team of mathematicians to back her up. Might the experiment have worked and the programme gone down better with a different presenter? Darren Brown, perhaps?
Welcome to the Whitgift Centre, Croydon. We hope your shopping experience is an uplifting one, and I'd like to bring to your pay attention some very special offers today. Details of our special offers can be found handily by the lifts, so why not come right arm up and see for yourself. These offers will only be available for a short period of time, so all customers wishing to reach up and grab this exciting opportunity should do it now.
But the BBC surely only had one presenter in mind for this programme. It had to be Hannah Fry. Having picked her up as a fledgling academic, invested intensively in her career to transform her into geek queen of mathematics, then successfully groomed and steered her into that all-important prophetic role of Patient Zero, She was always going to be the one to take the fall for the BBC when the COVID narrative inevitably started to crumble and disintegrate. So however much the unvaccinated programme is being hammered online and trashed by critics, it is clear that Hannah has once again performed her role beautifully, and that her gravity-defying career is far from heading for the skids. Here she is, a keynote speaker at the Disney Data and Analytics Conference 2022, given equal billing alongside Christine McCarthy, Senior Executive Vice President and Chief Financial Officer of the Walt Disney Company. Quote, her critically acclaimed BBC documentaries include City in the Sky, Magic Numbers, The Joy of Winning, The Joy of Data, and the 2018 film Contagion, The BBC Pandemic, a massive citizen science experiment aimed to simulate what would happen if a deadly pandemic were to come to the UK, a full 2 years before the predictions came true. Strange how the Walt Disney Company credits Hannah Fry with predicting the COVID pandemic. And Hannah herself is far from shy of taking credit for shaping world events.
I'm Professor Hannah Fry. I'm a mathematician and I worked on the data and the models that the government used to bring us out of that first lockdown.
It's true that Hannah did indeed help to steer the UK government's COVID pandemic policy, but to claim that her role was to bring the UK out of that first lockdown really is the most audacious piece of spin. I want to take a closer look at just what Hannah and her maths team were up to in the early weeks and months of 2020 and how they were involved in modelling the COVID pandemic. First of all, a reminder that the publicity for the Contagion BBC pandemic documentary claims that Hannah Fry masterminds the experiment of 2018, in addition to playing the starring role as Patient Zero. Now, the idea that Hannah was responsible for coming up with, designing and developing the whole project all by herself is clearly ridiculous. But my hours of patient searching for the real behind-the-scenes mastermind hasn't yet uncovered anyone I can confidently put in the frame. So for now at least, I am going to take the BBC at their word and accept that Hannah Fry really is the brains behind the whole BBC pandemic experiment, and that she personally gathered together her maths team, Petra Klepac, Adam Kucharski, Andrew Conlon, Stephen Kissler, Maria Tang and Julia Gog to help her create the BBC Pandemic Dream dataset, which proved so valuable in modelling the 2020 coronavirus outbreak. So here goes. On the 19th of February 2020, Petra Klepac issued this tweet, an announcement so important that it is still pinned to the top of her Twitter feed. Quote, remember the fantastic massive citizen science project behind the BBC4 pandemic project presented by Fry R²? We are releasing social contact matrices from contact data collected. The analysis of the full dataset is still ongoing, but we are releasing the contact matrices urgently, as they might be important in modelling UK's response to COVID-19. This paper, Contacts in Context, authored by Hannah Fry and the gang, clearly shows that the BBC pandemic dataset was available for use by pandemic modellers more than a month before Boris Johnson ordered the first lockdown on the 23rd of March 2020. Quote, these matrices are highly relevant for informing prevention and control of new outbreaks and evaluating strategies that reduce the amount of mixing in a population, such as school closures, social distancing or working from home. The emergence of the novel coronavirus disease, COVID-19, has created an urgent need for the best possible social mixing data to be made available to support the outbreak response. It is therefore our hope that this detailed contemporary picture of age-specific mixing patterns will be of value to those modelling COVID-19 to provide an evidence base for decisions on potential control measures in the UK. The lead author is Petra Klepac, who was also the lead author for the BBC pandemic paper released on the 22nd of March 2018 to accompany the broadcast of the Contagion documentary. I'll come back to her later, but the person I really want to focus on here is Adam Kucharski, Professor of Infectious Disease Epidemiology at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, LSHTM. I remember Adam Kucharski well from those opening scenes of the mainstream media Corona show. He was one of the trusted experts who had clearly been lined up in advance to prepare the public for what was about to unfold. He comes across as a hard-working and sincere academic, and I have little doubt that he believed then, and believes still, that everything he did was for the good of the nation. The possibility that he had been manipulated into performing a small but important bit part in a much larger stage show is unlikely to have entered his mind for a single moment. As a bright young thought leader, his role was to explain to the clever lefties that this novel coronavirus really was a serious danger, and then nudge them into accepting that they would have to surrender their rights and freedoms to combat the threat. These seeds were sown in early 2020 to give them time to germinate, and they quickly found very fertile ground. But Adam Kucharski was just one of many young, convincing, trusted experts ready to hit the ground running at the B of the bang. Although many of them may not have realised it, they had been manoeuvred into position to target the liberal progressive echo chambers and lure this demographic into the entrance of the lobster pot. This they achieved so smoothly and effectively that by March 2020, the lobsters themselves were clamouring as one for the total shutdown of the economy and house arrest for all, in response to the calamitous tsunami they sincerely believed was heading their way. Away from the public stage, Adam Kucharski was hard at work alongside dozens of other senior academics, feverishly running stochastic models to feed the brewing storm. On Wednesday, the 11th of March 2020, he and his colleagues at LSHTM issued this report to Spy M, The Impact of Aggressively Managing Peak Incidents, which states that modelling strategies are still predicted to overwhelm NHS services and result in very large numbers of deaths. A more aggressive management of the peak can reduce demand appreciably. Things were dramatically hotting up at this time, and we now know, through the words of Boris Johnson's Director of Communications, Lee Kane, that 3 days later a pivotal meeting took place at Number 10. Quote, I vividly remember the morning of Saturday, March the 14th, 2020, when, as part of a small team of advisors gathered in the Prime Minister's office, Boris Johnson was told that the initial plan for managing the pandemic was failing. The initial modelling used for crucial decisions, we found out, was very wrong. A review conducted by data experts recruited by Dominic Cummings uncovered that, unless we change course immediately, the NHS would be overwhelmed within 3 weeks. The PM sat in silence as 3 scenarios were sketched out on a whiteboard. The first looked at no restrictions, the second at social distancing measures, and the third considered a national lockdown. Only under the last option would the NHS avoid collapse. On that same day, Adam Kucharski was right in the thick of it, and he solemnly set out the grave situation in a series of tweets to his many thousands of followers. His followers then dutifully retweeted and added their own penny's worth to swell the growing clamour for a national lockdown. Then on Monday the 16th of March, the now infamous Consensus View on Behavioural and Social Interventions report appeared. This was the one that Neil Ferguson and his team at Imperial College London took the hit for, but as can be seen on the gov.uk website, the LSHTM Aggressive Management Report of March the 11th was one of the 4 papers which inform the Consensus View. It makes chilling reading. Now, what was poor old Boris to do?
Alright! Shut down the world so no one gets a cold. Shut down the world so no one gets a cold. Shut down the world so no one gets a cold. Shut down the world so no one gets a cold. The government and the media are helping us. Shut down the world so no one gets a cold.
3 weeks later, on the 9th of April, Hannah Fry and Professor Kucharski appeared together on a Horizon Coronavirus special, broadcast to a now terrified, spellbound and housebound BBC watching public.
The infection and transmission rate of the virus is one of the crucial pieces of information that the scientists modelling the pandemic use in their predictions. And right from the beginning, modelling the scale of the outbreak has been at the heart of government responses. We are all living under the lockdown that is a result of decisions based on modelling. But Adam, this is a crisis that's constantly evolving. How do you model something like this?
Models are really a tool we can use to ask what-if questions. What if you change interactions in a certain way? What effect might it have on the outbreak?
You were one of the very first people who were modelling this outbreak back in January, right?
Yes.
And of course, there was one model in particular that got a lot of attention in the press, a model by Imperial College London, looking at the impact of different interventions. So this graph has got time along the x-axis and critical care beds up the side. This is the classic curve.
So what we see here is the scenario where everyone just carries on as normal and the epidemic continues.
Terrifyingly large.
Exactly, and this is looking at a range of moderate interventions. Things like school closures, having more people working from home, maybe people self-isolating when they've got symptoms. And you can see that all of these different measures will slow the outbreak, so it will mean that there's less transmission, the peak is happening later, there's a reduction in the size, but it's not a huge reduction.
Yeah. Even with all of those interventions, when you actually include the critical care line, this is kind of a worrying picture.
Yes, this line is what was likely to be the capacity of critical care, so intensive care unit type beds in the UK. You can see that although some of these interventions reduce the size of the peak a lot, in terms of the demand you're requiring in hospital, it's still many, many times larger than the likely capacity that will be available.
It's not enough.
Nowhere near enough.
And that's why we're in lockdown now.
Yes, so this model and a number of other ones showed that you couldn't have these single, fairly moderate interventions that would be enough to make this manageable for the NHS. That really, without more dramatic reductions in transmission, these lockdown-type measures, you weren't going to flatten the curve enough to get below this line.
This is where we were. Is it where we still are?
Lockdown measure is going far, far beyond what any of these shorter, maybe kind of slightly lighter measures are doing. So I think it's likely our case numbers are now going to be much, much lower because we've got this lockdown in place.
By this time, the majority of the population had blindly and willingly gone along with the game of follow the progressive thought leader to be guided deep inside the lobster trap. They were well and truly stuck, and just like hapless lobsters, they were oblivious to their situation and had no understanding of what was to come. Moving on, we find this report on the gov.uk website. It was submitted to the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, SAGE, on the 16th of April 2020, using BBC pandemic data to model the impact of isolation, testing, contact tracing and physical distancing on reducing transmission of COVID-19. This one is particularly interesting because it appears to be the paper that Hannah Fry boldly claims credit for in the Unvaccinated documentary as bringing us out of the first lockdown. Reading through it, it is evident that this document was used to pave the way for the next phase of the scamdemic, which was to temporarily relieve the stranglehold on the British people by throwing them a bogus lifeline in the guise of the ill-fated COVID phone app tracing system. The majority eagerly took the bait, all of them sweetly oblivious to the realisation that they've fallen for one of the oldest confidence tricks in the book. Tell them what they want to hear and give them an easy-to-grasp solution. It worked like a charm. And so the masses stuck doggedly to the path of least resistance, not for one moment realising that dumb compliance was all that was required of them, and that all they had to do to truly free themselves from the stranglehold was to refuse to comply.
This is what you want, this is what you get. This is what you want, this is what you get. This is what you want, this is what you get. This is what you want, this is what you get. This is what you want, this is what you get. This is what you want, this is what you get.
I'm 37, so we were waiting that this was going to be our week. But today is my free day at work, so I decided to stay. They told me it's going to be a couple of hours, but I'll give it a try.
I had to wait in the walk-ins for like second doses and first doses as well, so and also I live quite close, so it's not too much of an issue. Although I can see why the wait might be a bit fast.
I went onto the website and it kept taking me through all of the steps, and then it would get to finding somewhere locally and I would click on it and then it would take me back to the beginning. And I did that about 6 times. It maybe took half an hour, and then eventually I just thought I'll go to the drop-in.
The BBC4 pandemic experiment has created an invaluable legacy. Thanks to tens of thousands of you across the country, we now have a new gold standard data set for pandemic research. A vast amount of information that will be shared with mathematicians from the Department of Health and pandemic researchers nationwide.
In 2017, the BBC commissioned a TV documentary in which presenter Hannah Fry played the role of Patient Zero as she spread a digital pathogen around the market town of Hazelmere in Surrey. Although billed as a groundbreaking experiment to help plan for when the next deadly virus comes to the UK, the programme was actually nothing more than a data-gathering exercise dressed up as a citizen science experiment. Then, in the early weeks of 2020, this newly minted BBC pandemic dataset was used to frighten the population into a trance state of bewilderment and compliance. I vividly remember the moment I first became aware of the true significance of this obscure documentary. It was on the morning of the 29th of February 2020 when I heard on BBC Radio that Hazelmere was the location of the UK's patient zero for COVID-19. This triggered a strong sensation of falling. I knew in my bones this was no spooky coincidence, but rather someone's idea of a very sick joke. Since then, I have been searching for clues as to who orchestrated this tawdry piece of theatre, and, more importantly, who exactly set up and designed the BBC pandemic simulation exercise. Central to the experiment was the BBC Pandemic app, which volunteers downloaded onto their phones to measure the spread of a digital pathogen as it infected people across the UK. The app was launched with a sweeping media blitz on the 27th of September 2017. This date is important because despite doing my level best to uncover any mention or trace of the BBC Pandemic project prior to this date, I have drawn a complete blank. There surely must have been meetings, discussions and documents in the months before the launch of this app, and I felt sure that I'd find some lead somewhere, but the only thing I came across was this. This is a paragraph from the February 2020 Contacts in Context paper mentioned earlier. Quote, "The study was approved by London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine Observational Research Ethics Committee, reference 14400. So I had a reference number for the Ethics Committee report regarding the BBC pandemic experiment, and I emailed LSHTM to ask for a copy. Now, bearing in mind that this project was commissioned by the BBC and funded by the British people, myself among them, via the compulsory TV licence, it doesn't seem unreasonable to expect such a document to be made available in the public domain. But my request was turned down flat. Quote, "We do not make ethics applications for research studies publicly available." Undeterred, I submitted a Freedom of Information request to LSHTM for a copy of the BBC Pandemic Ethics application and related documents. I then patiently waited the obligatory 20 working days for their reply. Nothing arrived. And so I started the ponderous process of chasing them up. Many voicemail messages and emails later, all of which went unanswered, I managed to unearth the email address of LSHTM's Head of Legal Services, Mr. Alex Hollander Carney. Only then did I receive a speedy and apologetic acknowledgement from one of his staff, and a few days later I received this, quote, "We have handled your request under the Freedom of Information Act 2000, and we can confirm that we hold the information you have requested. Please find our response to your request below. Unfortunately, we do not share ethics submissions that incorporate details of other ongoing research projects that are not yet completed, which could prejudice commercial interests if the research idea is stolen or subverted, and potential rights to first publication. The ethics submission also contains confidential information such as names and contact details, which we would not share due to data protection. After careful consideration, we have decided to withhold the information, as the public interest in withholding the information outweigh the factors in favour of disclosure. We have also engaged Section 40(2) of the Act, which covers personal information. Section 40(2) is an absolute exemption, and it is not subject to a public interest test. In truth, I don't quite know what to make of this, other than to say that for such an innocuous sounding document, they really do sound terribly keen to keep it on a very tight leash. Running through the rest of their reply, they turned down my request for other documents I had specified on similar grounds. Apart from a copy of the information provided to participants taking part in the BBC pandemic experiment and a redacted copy of the Ethics Committee approval letter. The former document does not appear to differ significantly from the information that appears on the BBC Pandemic website. Of more interest is the copy of the approval letter. In their email to me, LSHTM says that we have removed the personal data of the PI in line with section 40(2) of the Act. This demonstrates ethical review has taken place and an initial submission with amendments that were subsequently reviewed and accepted by the Chair. I assume that the abbreviation PI stands for Principal Investigator, and they have indeed rejected the name and job title of this person. Why on earth does LSHTM feel the need to invoke the Data Protection Act to protect the identity of the lead academic of a citizen science project that was commissioned and funded by the BBC? Withholding the name implies sensitivity and invites speculation, and since they've made it into a game of Guess Who, let's look at who might be in the frame. First of all, the date of the letter, 14th of September 2017, and the study title, BBC4 Citizen Science Project, confirms that this ethics application does indeed relate to the Contagion BBC4 pandemic documentary. Secondly, we know that the recipient of the letter was based at the Department of Epidemiology and Population Health. Thirdly, the list of approved documents includes the names of 4 investigators: Andrew Conlon, Julia Gogg, Stephen Kissler and Adam Kucharski, all of whom were members of Hannah Fry's maths team. So they can be ruled out along with Hannah Fry herself because she is employed by University College London. The 2 names missing from the roll call are Maria Tang and Petra Klepac. A quick search reveals that Maria Tang is based at Cambridge University, which just leaves Petra. And lo and behold, she does work for the Department of Epidemiology and Population Health at LSHTM. So my money is on Petra as the recipient of this letter. Here is the personal website of Petra Klepac. Her main academic post is Assistant Professor in Infectious Diseases at LSHTM, but she also lists Visiting Researcher at the University of Cambridge and an honorary affiliation with Public Health England on her home page. Now, Public Health England was in fact disbanded in October 2021, and its functions transferred to the UK Health Security Agency. But that's not important here because the time period of interest is 2017 to 2018. And here is Petra's CV. This confirms her association with Cambridge University and also shows that from 2016 to 2018 she was Honorary Research Fellow at Imperial College London. Petra Klepac was a rising star in her field, with high-profile roles in several key institutions. Looking back at her early career, from 2001 to 2007, she was at MIT, where she gained her PhD in biological oceanography. And from there, the trajectory of her career was shaped by 2 major awards. The first was the UNESCO Laureate for Women in Science postdoctoral fellow at Pennsylvania State University. And then she became AXA Research Fellow at the University of Cambridge to, quote, study self-enforcing international agreements in regional control of immunizing infections. By 2012, her career was firmly established down the path of infectious disease modelling, which seems a fair way removed from oceanography, but that's no surprise since there was plenty of big money sloshing around academia, targeted at bright young things to lure them away from their chosen interests and towards pandemic modelling. Looking even further back, we can see that Petra studied ecology for her first degree, graduating in 2001 from the University of Zagreb, Croatia. And from her Skills and Languages section, we find that she is indeed Croatian. And that small detail is very interesting. So in 2017, Petra Klepac landed the role of principal investigator for the BBC Pandemic Citizen Science Experiment. Central to the project was the procurement of a mobile phone app, which would simulate the spread of a deadly contagion. The BBC website categorically credits Big Motive, a company based in Northern Ireland, with developing the app, but I have discovered that's not quite true. On the 30th of March 2020, this article appeared in Time Out, Croatia. Quote, "It was only meant to be a simulation. When the BBC and Cambridge University enlisted the help of Zagreb-based software designers Q, the app they wanted them to build was for a dress rehearsal." So this Croatian software agency called Q claims that they were the ones who built the BBC Pandemic app. And here it is. Quote, "Q created an app which is intuitive, easy to use, but at the same time very precise in simulating how fast can a virus spread through the UK. Over 100,000 people took part in this experiment and helped create a new gold dataset standard for the future. BBC and Q took a huge leap forward in obtaining and processing information and data that could potentially save millions of lives." And there's more. Quote, "If someone told me 2 years ago, when we were working on the BBC Pandemic app, that a pandemic would suddenly become reality, I'd say there's no way. And well, it's happened," said Filip Ljubic, director of the Zagreb software company Q. He goes on to say, "It's almost unbelievable that so soon after the launch of the application, a brand new epidemic, coronavirus, really happened, and suddenly what the application simulated in theory began to happen in real life. Last week we were contacted again by the BBC and told they were considering developing a new application that would track people with coronavirus symptoms in real time. We've only had a few conversations so far and we're still waiting for the green light."
Draga djeco, poslušajte najljepšu modernu božićnu priču o tome kako su zapravo 3 vrijednosti našle put do Q-a.
Why would the BBC feel the need to airbrush out the role of the Croatian-based Q in developing the BBC Pandemic app? And what became of the BBC COVID symptom tracking app they were negotiating with Q in April 2020? So Zagreb, Croatia connects Petra Klepac and Q. In fairness, this could be a complete coincidence. I searched for an association between them and turned up nothing, but it does seem a little strange. It turns out that in her homeland she is something of a big name. And behind the scenes she was hard at work as a senior member of the Croatian government's scientific council, the equivalent of UK's SAGE committee, doing her bit to make sure that government policy did not stray from its ultimate goal, multiple jib-jobs for all. So is Petra Klepac the true mastermind behind the BBC pandemic experiment? Well, no, I don't believe she is, and the giveaway is this one sentence from the paper published on March the 22nd, 2018 to accompany the BBC Contagion documentary. Quote, we were asked to ensure that the epidemic was seeded in Haslemere. As lead author of the paper, I believe these are the words of Petra Klepac, which means that she was not the one responsible for setting up the Haslemere Patient Zero scenario. A hidden hand was pulling the strings to make it happen. In truth, I suspect a whole forest of hidden hands behind this particular piece of theatre, and the BBC Pandemic Project was just one of many predictive appetisers served up to the audiences around the globe to ensure that Act 1 of the 2020 Corona show went off without a hitch. So who is the hidden maestro behind the BBC Pandemic Project? First off, a reminder that the BBC Pandemic Simulation was a collaborative project involving 3 big institutions: the BBC, LSHTM and Cambridge University. And these people were selected to be the public faces of the project. Hannah Fry and her co-presenter, Javed Abdulmaneem for the BBC, Petra Klepac and Adam Kucharski for LSHTM, and Julia Gogg, Stephen Kisler, Andrew Conlon and Maria Tang for Cambridge University. The 2 people chosen to lead the project for their respective universities were Petra Klepac and Julia Gogg. Petra seems a little camera shy, so it was up to Julia Gogg to reveal the shock horror results to the 2 BBC presenters, both of whom could act well enough to have their facial expressions firmly set to aghast. The full title of the TV programme was Contagion, the BBC4 Pandemic. It was broadcast on the 22nd of March 2018, and it was in fact just one of many programmes, articles and news stories put out that year by the BBC as part of the Spanish Flu 100 Years On series. Quote, "It's been a century since the Spanish flu claimed up to 100 million lives. It's only a matter of time until a similar strain re-emerges." The central running theme was that a global epidemic on the scale of Spanish flu was both inevitable and imminent. Sinister background music and doomy images were used to ram the message home. And the BBC Pandemic app itself carried this message as a kind of welcome greeting. The most likely and immediate threat to our species is a global pandemic of a highly infectious and deadly disease. Throughout 2018, the BBC drip-fed these messages to their audiences, quietly seeding the idea that a deadly flu-type disease was soon to emerge in humans and spread around the globe, and that the consequences would be catastrophic. But this omen wasn't just aimed at the public. It had also been implanted in the minds of the thousands of academics around the world, whose services would be crucial in kicking off and maintaining the illusion of the COVID pseudo-pandemic when the time came. And so, by the start of 2020, Hannah Fry and her maths team were all present and correct at their starting blocks, keyed up and just waiting for the signal. News of a novel coronavirus emerging in China and starting to spread would have come as no surprise to any of them. After all, this is what they had been expecting all their careers, and they'd spent years modelling just such an eventuality. What's more, with the recent excitement of being selected to work with the BBC still fresh, they were all able to participate in shaping the government's pandemic policy thanks to the dream data set created for them courtesy of volunteers lured in to do their bit for citizen science. These academics and many of their peers were suddenly thrown into a world where their services were in great demand, and they rose to the challenge, writing reports and papers for SPI-M, dealing with requests from the media for expert commentary, and feeding their ever-hungry followers on social media with real-time dispatches from the front line. These were the experts we were all commanded to trust over and over, to the steady strengthening background drumbeat provided courtesy of the BBC. And so the majority of the population were manipulated into a trance state of unquestioning obedience, not realising that the experts themselves had been worked on for years to get them to the point where they'd be the first to enter the lobster trap when the time came. All over the world, the same drama was playing out in exactly the same way, even using the same commands. But there was just one moment in the UK which could have made a difference, and that was the day news broke of the spooky Haslemere coincidence. There's no question that the weirdness of this revelation jolted the BBC Pandemic Maths team and Hannah Fry herself into a sudden state of awareness. They all knew something extremely fishy was going on, and my guess is that they had a very good idea who was behind it, but they chose to close their eyes and ears to this dead giveaway and continue headlong into the trap. So, if Hannah Fry and her maths team were the visible faces of the BBC pandemic simulation experiment, who were the operators backstage controlling the show? The field of candidates here is wide, but I have selected these 4 to illustrate what I believe was likely going on. They are all senior academics in the field of mathematics and epidemiology, and they were all heavily involved with establishing the narrative during the early days of the Corona show in 2020. I call them the mentors. I'll start with Graham Medley, Professor of Infectious Disease Modelling at LSHTM. He became known to many in 2020 as the chair of SPI-M, and we know from the direct testimony of Julia Gogg that he selected and groomed her into accepting a significant position on SPI-M sometime in 2019. 3 others from the BBC Pandemic Maths team were also recruited to SPI-M, and were handily in position to help steer the trajectory of the UK government's COVID policy. Was it Graham Medley who gave the green light for the BBC pandemic dataset to be released for free use by all academics, much to the evident astonishment of Julia Gogg?
And then finally, and this is the big one for us, we've got permission and the terms and conditions that individuals are signing up for. This data set will be made available to all scientists.
And is that unusual to have this kind of data set available for other people to study?
I don't know anything like it.
And was Graham Medley a member of the team who designed the pandemic simulation exercise for the BBC? As a senior modeller at LSHTM, his experience would make him a likely candidate to act as a consultant. Next up, this is Professor David Heymann. He too is a senior professor at LSHTM, but much more than that, he's a global player and the biggest of big cheeses. He's an American citizen, and during his career he has held many extremely influential positions at the World Health Organization, the US CDC, and Public Health England. He is currently Distinguished Fellow in the Global Health Programme at Chatham House, and is a long-time associate of Anthony Fauci. In 2021, he appeared alongside Hillary Clinton as a speaker at the Global Soft Power Summit, hosted in partnership with BBC Global News. But it's this detail from his CV that caught my attention. He was chair of Public Health England at the same time that Petra Klepac was employed there as senior mathematical modeller, and they are also both affiliated to the same faculty and department at LSHTM. We know from my F.O.I. request that the principal investigator for the BBC pandemic study was based at this department. Could the Ethics Committee letter have been addressed to David Heymann? I somehow doubt that, as I'm pretty confident that Petra Klepac was the principal investigator. However, the BBC pandemic dataset is owned by LSHTM, and it was commercial interests that caused my F.O.I. request to be rejected. So my bet is that David Heymann, as a senior member of the department, had background involvement in this project at the time. Moving on to Sir David Spiegelhalter. Anyone who is paying attention to BBC coverage of the COVID pseudo-pandemic will likely know his name. He was given a lot of airtime as one of their go-to trusted experts who could be relied on never to stray off narrative. And he never did. He is an old hand who knows the ropes when it comes to TV appearances. Here he is being interviewed by the sainted Brian Cox in 2018. And he is clearly held in high esteem by Hannah Fry, who is in awe of his mathematical prowess and speaks warmly of him as a good friend. Amongst his many TV and radio appearances for the BBC, there's one that stands out as significant. Climate Change by Numbers, first broadcast in 2015 on BBC 4, the same channel that commissioned the BBC pandemic documentary. As you can see, Hannah Fry was a co-presenter on this programme. Was this where she was tried for size by the BBC as presenter of the upcoming pandemic documentary? And was David Spiegelhalter involved in putting her name forward and maybe coaching her for the role of Patient Zero? And finally, we have Professor Brian Grenfell, OBE. I've included him because his name kept coming up time and again when I researched the backgrounds of the maths team. He is the only behind-the-scenes academic I've managed to link directly to the BBC Pandemic Project. This University of Cambridge webpage from August 2021 shows that Julia Gogg and Brian Grenfell were working together to increase, quotes, public engagement with science, and it cites the BBC Pandemic Project as an example. Brian Grenfell's CV reveals some interesting details, but first to Wikipedia. He's a British citizen who started his career at Imperial College London, then Cambridge University in 1990. But in 2004 he moved to the USA and has been working at Princeton University as Professor of Ecology and Public Affairs since 2009. His Wikipedia page makes particular mention that he started his career under the tutelage of Professor Sir Roy Anderson, whose own Wikipedia page credits him with being, quotes, a leading international authority on the epidemiology and control of infectious diseases and author of the most highly cited book in the field. According to the website Powerbase, Anderson was brought in as a government advisor in 2009 to, quote, provide cross-government scientific advice regarding the outbreak of swine flu, and he was rewarded handsomely by the board of GlaxoSmithKline for his troubles. Even more interestingly, in 2001 the UK government put Anderson in charge of charting the epidemiological progress of the foot and mouth disease outbreak, in which he pushed the strategy of the contiguous cull, which led to the slaughter and burning of thousands of healthy animals on massive pyres. And who did Anderson have on his team in 2001? Well, Neil Ferguson of Imperial College for one, but also Dr. Brian Grenfell, who is on the record as being an enthusiastic supporter of the slaughter and cull policy. So Brian Grenfell's career was heavily shaped by the influence of Roy Anderson in the UK before he departed for the USA. And here is Grenfell's CV, which says that his current funding comes from the National Institutes of Health, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and the US Department of Homeland Security. Scrolling down the list of postdoctoral scholars and research assistants, we can see just how many of them have been funded by the NIH, the Gates Foundation, and the Department of Homeland Security. And there are 3 familiar names on this list: Julia Gogg, Andrew Conlon, and Petra Klepac. So their careers have in turn been shaped by Brian Grenfell. Grenfell has also co-authored many papers with Adam Kucharski, and he gets a warm thanks in a recent tweet by Stephen Kissler for patiently mentoring him through his training. But out of these, the one who Grenfell seems to have influenced the most is Petra Klepac. Quote, "My interest and work in control and management of infectious diseases developed during my postdoc with Professor Brian Grenfell at Princeton University. In 2016, they worked together on this paper, Self-Enforcing Regional Vaccination Agreements, which says that the work began as part of a vaccine refusal workshop and was funded by the Gates Foundation, the Department of Homeland Security, and the NIH. And there's another telling snippet at the end of this paper on foot and mouth disease, written in 2017. Quote, "We are grateful for insight provided by Petra Klepac and Brian Grenfell." So was it Brian Grenfell who brought Petra Klepac and the rest of the maths team together for the BBC pandemic assignment in 2017? He certainly had a big hand in moulding their careers and guiding them into the field of epidemic modelling of infectious diseases, a field massively bloated with an endless supply of easy money. And speaking of money, he who pays the piper calls the tune. And it's clear that someone with an awful lot of money has been calling an awful lot of tunes. Now, I wonder who that could be. Absolutely no prizes for guessing. It's beyond all reasonable doubt that Gates's sticky fingerprints are everywhere. The COVID pandemic is their baby, and aren't they both such proud parents? Now, I'm well aware this isn't much of a finale, but the BBC pandemic simulation exercise turns out to be a useful illustration of just how the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has been worming its way into academic and media institutions for years. Starting with the BBC, it's common knowledge that Gates Foundation money, to the tune of many millions, has ensured a cosy relationship and bought a lot of airtime, along with many weirdly reverential interviews on primetime conducted by the BBC's leading lights. Way back in 2016, Bill had already got his feet well under the table at the Beeb and was brazenly steering the narrative to get us all in the mood for the upcoming deadly pandemic. And in March 2017, this creepy little animated explainer appeared on BBC Future. Quote, "Historically, it's taken years for a new vaccine to be created for several reasons. One is that science is complicated and you have to build special manufacturing. Second, the approval. How people are indemnified, who should take charge, hasn't been clear. The vaccine market for typical diseases works fairly well, but there isn't a business there. We've done simulations that show if you can get a vaccine in less than a year, how beneficial that would be for the next Ebola. Or something more serious, like a global flu epidemic." Well, he certainly had those problems ironed out in time, didn't he just? Meanwhile, at LSHTM, the Gates Foundation has found another welcome host, and sharing the big bucks clearly buys a lot of influence. So much so that when Bill pays the school a visit, he is sure to be fawned over as an honoured guest. Quote, "We are delighted that Bill Gates has been able to visit us and taken the time to hear about some of our work. His leadership has been transformational for global health. The Foundation is a very important funder and in many ways helps to drive the global health agenda." And so to Cambridge University, where Gates Foundation money buys a slightly different kind of influence in the form of the Gates Cambridge Scholarship. Quote, "The goal of Gates Cambridge is to build a global network of leaders who will work together to improve people's lives." This one is interesting because Bill's father, Bill Gates Sr., played a part in establishing the scholarship. He was actively engaged with Gates Cambridge until his death in 2020. Quote, "The Cambridge University community is saddened to hear of the death of Bill Gates Sr., who was instrumental in creating the Gates Cambridge Trust with a donation from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation that remains the largest single gift Cambridge has ever received. And his influence lives on in the form of the Bill Gates Sr. Prize. What is more, this obituary on the Gates Cambridge website says that Bill Gates Sr.'s wife, Dr. Mimi Gates, is a current trustee of the Gates Cambridge Trust and works tirelessly to ensure that his values continue to inform the vision and work of the programme. And here she is. So the Gates Cambridge Scholarship is very much a father-son enterprise. And one of the BBC Pandemic Maths team was indeed a Gates Cambridge scholar. Stephen Kistler, originally of University of Colorado Boulder, received the scholarship in 2014, and in 2017 he was charged with the task of modelling the Hazelmere outbreak. His previous tutor at Boulder gave him a glowing reference. Stephen is one of those rare students who quietly and without fanfare changes the landscape. His research is likely to have a significant impact on the way we manage disease on an international scale, but he is also a humanitarian whose greatest strengths lie in his ability to connect on a human level. This may well be true, and it gives a snapshot into the character of the ideal recruit for the Gates Cambridge Scholarship. I could go on. Scratch the surface anywhere, and Gates Foundation money is never hard to find, but you get the picture. It was clear from the start that there was only one escape route for the lobsters in the trap, and that was to join the queue for a mysterious new injection, then another and another. Next time, just what is this man up to?
You released a memo today that says global innovation is the key to limiting the damage. What innovation are you talking about? What's the number one priority? What do we have to innovate first?
Well, in the near term, it's the scaling up of testing and prioritizing who gets testing and getting the quick results. In the midterm, it's these treatments that can cut the death rate down potentially dramatically. And then the final solution, which is a year to 2 years off, is the vaccine. So we've got to go full speed ahead on all three fronts. And then the final solution, which is a year to 2 years off, is the vaccine. So we've got to go full speed ahead on all three fronts.
Bill Gates stated in 2020 that the final solution to the pandemic will be a vaccine. You can decide what that means. Of course, he's referring to, and he knows he's old enough. But in other words, this is a kind of final solution.